In light of my recent uptick in making long-form content on TikTok of all places, I've decided to shift my priorities a little bit, instead choosing to post discussion-based commentaries where I have a better mic, a better editing software, more time to record, and more time to actually formulate my thoughts into cohesive sentences. And of course, with all the hubbub and controversy surrounding the current Overwatch 5v5 versus 6v6 debate, I figured I'd share my own, not asked for opinions on the matter, from the perspective of someone who tries to flex into all three roles, in both quick play and competitive, by myself, scaling all the way up to having full 5 stacks. Also, before we move forward, please remember, these are just my opinions. I know opinions can be a little bit difficult to decipher as opinions nowadays, but I'm really just trying to foster more discussion around this topic because I feel like no one who is advocating for 5v5 is going to be bringing up some of the points that I'm going to bring up. Also, keep in mind that a lot of what I'm saying here isn't exactly rooted in hard data. Most of it's kind of just rooted in my current experiences with the game, comparing them to my experiences in Overwatch 1, and just generally a lot of speculation. Content creators like Ezrein have actually played the 6v6 game mode before, and they can use a lot of that empirical evidence from playing to back up their points. And I don't want my opinions to be seen as the end-all be-all, since I'm kind of just some dude on the internet. A dude on the internet who loves discussion. And a lot of this is also just rooted in curiosity, because I'm curious to see how this whole discussion ends up panning out. The entire issue of Overwatch 5v5 and 6v6 has been a hotly contested topic since the announcement of Overwatch 2 moving to a 5-person team game, and it's only gotten more hotly contested since then, with multiple content creators going back and forth on the issue, throwing out new ideas for how the game should be formatted to address the current issues of 5v5, and for a while, a lot of us thought Blizzard wasn't going to budge on the issue because, hey, that's a pretty big fundamental change, and there's clearly a lot of underlying reasons why they did it. That wouldn't really be a smart idea to just revert back that change after less than 2 years, right? Well, as of the time of me recording this script, and maybe like a week and a half before I recorded this, a dev post was actually made addressing the concerns of the team size. That's right, after like 18 months of us constantly bringing the issue to the table, Blizzard is finally at least willing to have a civil discussion with us. As a person who's probably put 2,500 hours or so into Overwatch 1 and 2 combined, I've seen a lot of opinions from the community, I've seen a lot of opinions from content creators, I've heard opinions from my friends, and I've seen the concerns that Blizzard has made in the blog post. After examining all of these, I'm still seeing very few tangible reasons why it would be even a good idea to keep 5v5 as the default, or at least any tangible reasons as to why they shouldn't consider bringing 6v6 back, since it would just be an interesting test. I've mostly chalked a lot of these reasons up to, like, most of the issues in 6v6 not actually being resolved with the switch to 5v5, the overall experience for the tank role, and I mean everybody by that extension, and this change actually kind of going against the main reason why Blizzard even designed Overwatch 1 around a 6-man team in the first place. Before I get to my actual own opinions here, I want to comment on a comment that was left on Ezrein's original video from this person. This is a great fucking point. They said, I think the big reason they're so stubborn with 5v5 is because it's kind of the only Overwatch 2 promise that they actually delivered on. The PvE mode was released in a much less substantial state, basically just another story mission, except behind a fucking paywall. The battle pass and new monetization model ended up being much less generous than the old system, where you could actually earn stuff while playing the game. We couldn't even get credits on launch. The new characters were also initially locked behind a battle pass or an insane amount of grinding. Even fucking weapon inspect animations, a feature found in every other modern FPS game, were implemented as a feature that you have to pay for on a new tier of overpriced cosmetics. That last part specifically strikes me because I was talking to my friend yesterday, he's a Reinhardt main, and he was like, guys, guess how much this weapon skin is? And me and my friends were like, $40. And he was like, no, it's actually like 65 because you have to pay 40 for the hammer, and then if you want to get all of like the cool flourishes and the cool flares and the ability to inspect your weapon, that's like another 20 to 30 bucks, which I think is actually the biggest fucking sham that this company has ever fucking done to us in Overwatch. Continuing on with the comment here, he says, besides 5v5, what actually separates Overwatch 1 from Overwatch 2? The new characters, the new game modes, the new maps? We could have gotten all of these things as regular updates for Overwatch 1. It's like they wanted to revamp the microtransactions to make more money, which I believe in because they apparently weren't making a lot of money playing Overwatch 1, but knew that if they did that it would just piss people off, so they tried to obfuscate it under a bunch of substantial updates, enough to warrant a rebranding of a new game that they can then dump on Steam and lure in new groups of players. Maybe there was a time where they legitimately thought 5v5 was the future of the game, but it morphed into an excuse of rebalancing all of their heroes so that they can brag about how much they're changing the game and paying attention to player feedback, which, guys, it's a bad sign when you have this many large balance patches, like just in general. It means the developers keep fucking up and keep needing to change shit, and who can blame them? They're stuck with a massive inherent design flaw in the game and they can't change it because it'll be like saying, we might as well go back to Overwatch 1. What a fucking disaster. The biggest game of square peg, round hole I've ever seen in my life. Now let me move on to my actual points here. 6v6 just generally leads to less counterswapping, since you're not in an arms race to just make the enemy tank play the game as little as possible. This was both empirically proved by a lot of the games that were played in the 6v6 game mode, and like, maybe this is just coming from my own experience with Overwatch 1, but I genuinely don't remember counterswapping being that massive of an issue, unless you wanted to swap to like, some flanker character to take care of a sniper, some tank buster to try and take care of a particularly problematic tank on the team. And that genuinely might have been it. Like, I don't ever remember seeing like, oh, this tank is kicking our ass, so we need to swap to the just crazy batshit insane counter to counter their tank. That just wasn't a thing in the first game. Despite the Schrodinger's tank issue, where they are both too strong to fight against and also die when they get looked at funny, many of the tanks are still hard-coded to counter other tanks by their core design, meaning no number of reasonable number changes will stop some tanks from just getting run over by other tanks. You can keep buffing D.Va as much as you want, like in the video mentioning having 4 patches in a row of buffs for her, but as long as Zarya does a lot of damage and is a beam character, people will just swap to her if D.Va is being oppressive to her team. Tank is the role that gets asked to counterswap the most, since we as a community have been conditioned to counterswap at the first sign of any lost fight. God forbid the other 2 roles in the game do that rather than asking their tank to do it, but at least with 2 tanks you can like kind of work something out so you don't have to ask your tanks to swap when you lose one singular engagement. Sure, this might not resolve the entire issue, since at this point in this state of Overwatch it's kind of a community-rooted issue now, but I have a vague feeling that if you brought back the second tank, you wouldn't see this happening nearly as often. Granted, that would also require a lot of balance changes on the tanks, but like that's the whole point. 5v5 has made the queue times faster, which is proven data that's been collected by Blizzard. Like, that's just facts you can't really argue with. As a person who flexed into all roles in Overwatch 1, I don't really remember having egregiously long queue times compared to Overwatch 2, which just may be due to like player counts between the 2 games. And I mean, I've played on a pretty wide spectrum in quick play and competitive, from silver all the way up to like 3400 MMR at my peak, which was like mid-masters in Overwatch 1 if I'm not mistaken. Blizzard did point out an interesting fact, which is that the rough ratio of players currently playing Overwatch between the 3 roles is already a 1-2-2 for tank, damage, and support respectively, and it's been that way since like the latter half of Overwatch 1, making the switch a no-brainer from the perspective of queue times. This is another point of data that I can't exactly contend with because the facts are just right there. However, I also generally think a lot more players would find the tank role fun if a very big chunk of the game wasn't relying on them navigating around the various hurdles that we've talked about so far and will continue to talk about for the foreseeable future. Like, I generally think that the tanks in Overwatch 2 from like a core gameplay design, like from their individual kits, are a lot more fun than a lot of them were in Overwatch 1, and it's not just because they keep gigabuffing them off the face of the earth. I think every new tank has incredibly fun and engaging gameplay, interesting and rewarding kits, and I think a lot of players would like the idea of playing them if they just didn't have to juggle around the responsibilities of 2 tanks on their back when they're only 1 person. And I also wouldn't be surprised if we actually saw a sharp drop in tank players from Overwatch 1 to 2, because the gameplay loop from match to match ultimately felt less rewarding to play. It felt less like you were either more skilled or more coordinated, or were constantly having to play tanks that you didn't want to play because of the sharp imbalance of tanks, requiring constant counterswapping. And oh, also your ult advantage doesn't really mean as much anymore because they added in a 15% carryover, which almost directly tells me that they're at least semi-okay with counterswapping to this degree. Sure, it was nerfed from like 25%, but like the fact that it still carries over in the first place means that they're like perfectly fine with counterswapping. I'll cave in and say that a lot of why people don't like to play tank is also either due to power level or their general playmaking ability, but I can't say wholeheartedly that Blizzard has tried to make the gap less substantial in any meaningful ways, really only offering tank players loot boxes, additional XP, or priority queues into other roles that they would probably much rather play. Blizzard essentially only gave people who weren't that much into tanks a very shallow and one-dimensional reward for actually playing them, rather than trying to actually sit down and figure out how to balance the tanks to make them more rewarding and engaging to play with and play against. All of these points are mostly to speak to the idea that, like, there are things that they can try to do to either make the tank player ratio closer to that 2-2-2 that they're hoping for, but I also get that many people already think the Overwatch queue times are too long, so if they get even longer as a result of bringing a second tank back and needing to wait for another person to show up, that would be a very good reason for them to drop the game. I've always been of the opinion that, like, when you're talking about queue times, you basically are dealing with either you have to deal with slightly longer queue times in exchange for a better balanced match, or you're fine with sitting through queues that are significantly shorter, but for the risk that you're just going to get into a horribly imbalanced game. That's mostly referring to, like, game balance, like team balance and, like, a skill balance between the teams, and not necessarily actually having to find another person to fill the role that you're looking for, but it's just an interesting thing to think about. Adding a second tank back into the game would invariably reduce some of the burden on the other tank, and while we can all agree that the balancing would be incredibly fucked up at first, that doesn't mean we shouldn't at least give it a shot. I mean, Blizzard and the Overwatch community are valid for saying that the game would be horrendously balanced with the addition of the second tank back into the game, but that shouldn't really matter to the players because that's kind of expected for the first cycle of the game, and they can learn to fine-tune it from there because that's the whole job of the dev. As the game is currently balanced, a lot of people's gut reaction was to call this patch the death of Overwatch, which I kind of understand why that happens. The Overwatch dev team has always struggled to balance the game, and with the state of the game generally being pretty rocky, everyone is instinctively going for the game dead go next reaction because, I don't know, boomer humor is just as prevalent as it's always been, and those number changes were essentially buffing the parts of tank that people already thought were too strong. I don't personally like what a lot of the changes to tank mean for the health of the game. Sure, it's made tank fun to play and has made them feel pretty strong, but I don't really like the principle that it's setting, and it's bonkers to think that these drastic-ass changes were the things that seemed to be needed to actually make the tank feel rewarding to play for people playing the tank. The changes that essentially turn them into unkillable kaijus. It's kind of like the health and the hitbox changes, and in those instances, I didn't really feel affected by them, and I still don't really feel like the changes do much, but I don't like the precedent that it set. I don't like the fact that we've essentially tried babying the player base and making it so they don't actually have to click on the enemy gamer to do damage. I wanted to point to a couple of specific issues that were addressed by Aaron Keller in his long-ass dev blog post about the history of Overwatch 1's format changes, the struggles they had to deal with each of those formats, and their general final thoughts when deciding to switch to 5v5. But first I wanted to look at one very, very prevalent point that many people in this discussion have been bringing up left and right. The idea that the main reason they removed the second tank was due to double shield. This is an offshoot of a general problem of defense-heavy bunker comps, but the main point of contention within the community seems to be focusing on this style, and I kind of know why. I 150% understand where they're coming from. I understand that many content creators bring up the fact that having another player on your team created an additional level of complexity that could bring up the entire strength of an entire team comp by a significant margin, but for people to claim that double shield would be just as oppressive in an Overwatch 2 6v6 format feels a little bit disingenuous and kind of ignores the fact that shields were removed off of one tank in the whole game. Shields were nerfed for all characters that could use them besides Zarya, but I don't know who's playing Zarya in double shield. Shields on new heroes that weren't in Overwatch 1 are pretty balanced in the grand scheme of things, and the fact that the game is just generally a lot more fast-paced to be able to move around these shields. This is one of the many points that they address that I genuinely feel is at least mostly nullified by so many other changes that were made that had nothing to do with the format change and removing the second tank. I've had plenty of people tell me that double shield was so horribly imbalanced that they didn't know how to balance it, so they just axed the second tank. And every single time I just look at what we have now, which is that they counterbalance shields to not make them feel as oppressive and give them counterplay, and they still removed the second tank. I know that double shield is not the entire reason that the changes were made, because that would just be silly to assume, and I'm not here to say that double shield wouldn't come back in Overwatch 2 if they brought back the second tank, just because, like, if there's a strategy in Overwatch that can work in some scenario, people are going to play it, but I can't imagine it being nearly as big of an issue as it was in Overwatch 1. The issue of counterpicking in this game was almost entirely caused by the switch from 6v6 to 5v5, because the tank is like the main pillar upon which the integrity of an entire team comp is held up, and players realized that, hey, maybe if we all shoot the thing that is protecting the 4 other squishies that I want to eliminate, we can just win the game. And if they weren't doing that, they realized, hey, this tank may never die even after the inevitable heat death of the universe, but if they can't keep us off of their squishies, we also just win the game. At least if you have like a second tank in the game, the entire strategy for playing Overwatch doesn't just devolve down to shoot only their squishies and say fuck all to the tank, or dump every single ability that you have into the tank, hope he dies, and if he does, then just kill the rest of his team. This entire issue goes against like the main reason why Overwatch 1 was balanced the way that it was, around 6v6. They basically landed on a 6v6 format because if you had anything less than 6 players on your team, then each individual death meant too much and your team would just crumble. But anything more than 6 players on a team would lead to each player or each individual play not really meaning anything, removing player agency from all players in the game. Obviously, with the new dawn of Overwatch 2, your vision can change, and I get that. In Blizzard's case, they were totally fine with players having more agency by removing one pillar from each team, thus allowing any one particular player to have a higher impact on the game state. But now we've had the exact inverse effect happen, where having one teammate who is even slightly below the general skill level of the lobby can just lose you the game, which for a while was actually much more likely to occur due to the Overwatch MMR system just being completely out of whack. This can have micro effects, like having an immobile support getting spawn camped by a Sombra for the rest of the match, and it can scale all the way up to that guy who plays Winston, gets a few too many kills on the enemy team, and then they decide to swap to Mauga, Reaper, Bastion on a Brig, and buddy, you just lost yourself the match. The only other characters in the game to get this kind of counter-swapping treatment are like snipers, Pharah, and maybe sometimes like an immobile support in the back who is just generally providing way too much value to their team. On top of this being like one of the de facto ways to just lose you a match, it's also just like a deep cultural problem where most players aren't willing to just be better than them, and it's infinitely worse with the general state of tank balance numbers in their kits. Why be better than them when you can just play the character who's gigabuff to shit and also counters that character by default? Just play the game, be better! All in all, by adding back in the second tank, you at least open yourself up to more options than just tank off until you win or die, or completely ignore the tank and still functionally take them out of the fight. In a video like this, you probably weren't expecting an issue of power creep to come up, primarily because this kind of just comes up in a different way. I'm not talking about something like Kiriko is just the best support since sliced bread. Wait, hold on, that's not how that works. Or Lifeweaver is so damn bad that he had to be reworked after like a month into his release. Overwatch 1 was designed from the ground up around 6 players. Granted, it was technically designed around being able to stack multiple of the same hero on one team for a while, but at a fundamental core level, this game was balanced around your tank that would hold the front line, your tanks that would add extra firepower, and your tank that would keep the backline safe from that little British bastard. Some tanks were literally designed around being a second option to your main line of defense, much like how you'd have a Zenyatta as your off support for more utility and damage alongside your Ana, who can pump out a sustainable level of healing. There are tanks that were designed in a way that you could not possibly, reasonably have them as your main tank, unless you want to risk the lives of your team or risk losing the value that your character brings. Like Wrecking Ball. I'll give it to them that they've added some pretty neat features into Wrecking Ball's kit as a whole to give him some team support ability, but people already don't play Wrecking Ball because he's kind of a mechanical monster to have to learn. Most people who are playing the hamster are not going to give a shit about giving your team 75 over shields or whatever. They're just going to keep running in at the enemy supports, getting slept, and dying on cooldown. That's also to speak to the point that like some of these abilities that they've tried to give for team support ability are kind of just lackluster, and you can tell that they very much put them in because they're trying to allow characters like Hamster to be a main tank, which I respect, but like, it sucks. Most of the tanks that have been thriving in this day and age are either the ones that are new or the ones that are actually updated to fit with the new game's code. Unfortunately, there are just some tanks in the game that you can't just give a new coat of paint to without replacing the whole damn body. There are some tanks who have been released, like Ramatra, who can provide some of the value of 2 tanks, being able to shield and generally absorb damage, before whipping out the left and right hooks to just walk at their DPS. There are also tanks like Junker Queen, who give her team an extra 100 to 150 overhealth or something, plus some movement speed, and also have the ability to just axe someone's face off. Compare that to tanks like Reinhardt, who mostly were designed to be a stronghold. They've given him some buffs here and there, and he has a pretty damn good offensive ultimate, but up until this season, Reinhardt has generally been considered to be like the worst tank, or like bottom 3, because like 60% of his value, if not more, was built into his shield and his ability to move his team around. He also probably sucks a little bit because he's like forced to be in only slightly longer than melee distance to do what he does best, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but unfortunately, that kind of decision is what's going to leave some tanks like this in the dark for the majority of the game's life cycle. They certainly tried to rectify some of this in Overwatch 2, but the maps, the game modes, and the hero kits were built off of the core 2-2-2 format. Those maps, game modes, and hero kits were ported over to Overwatch 2. Most of the old tanks were counterbalanced to fit into their new vision of 5v5, but you know what they fucking forgot about? They forgot about the tank shredders, flanking characters, and characters whose entire kits were built to deny value on the enemy tank without having to actually kill them. I mean, Ana has been nerfed and buffed and nerfed and buffed and nerfed and buffed again to address her general strength in the game and her ability to shut down tanks for like 4 to 5 seconds, single-handedly. For the first year of Overwatch 2's life cycle, characters like Reaper and Bastion, they didn't necessarily run the game since they kind of had their own underlying issues, but I'd be lying if I told you that they were any fun to fight against. At least in Overwatch 1, if you had a stationary Bastion pressuring your shield or something, you could at least have a different tank avoid him and either go kill the people keeping the Bastion alive, or just walk at his flank because he can't look at two people at once. Characters like this were designed to break through tanks, but in Overwatch 1 they also at least required an understanding of who you should be targeting amongst the tanks, and if you even should be targeting the tanks sometimes. In Overwatch 2, the tanks were altered to be able to be more self-sufficient and fill multiple roles, but not a damn thing changed about characters like Reaper and Bastion's ability to just rip and tear through them. Compounding on these issues of stuff generally not being accounted for when they essentially removed about 17% of your team, they finally realized that certain DPS characters were too strong, so they allowed the tanks to be tankier, for some abilities to be able to absorb some damage, and for some tanks to be able to go toe-to-toe with the DPS characters. Then they realized that the healing was too strong, so they enabled the DPS to fight back by applying a 20% healing reduction on their shots as opposed to just nerfing healing outright, and then they realized that that was too strong, so they only made it half as effective on tanks. But God forbid you're not playing a DPS, so you can never actually break through anyone being healed by a healer. Then the tanks got that buff to make CC not as effective on them, which further let certain tanks just run at the enemy team without a care in the world. Then tanks were getting pushed around too much, so they also gave them a buff against displacement CC, and that made Lucio fucking awful to play because that's like half of his value, so they toned it down a little bit. But now you can't even so much as push the goddamn tanks away. Tanks were getting domed too hard by sniper characters and characters like Cassidy, so they thought that headshot resistance needed to be a part of the tank passive, but only on the armor part, and somehow they thought that that was a good idea when Orisa is 75% armor. Meanwhile, tanks like Zarya literally get 0 buffs against the supposed problem characters. To make up for all of this, they changed armor from being a percentage of damage reduction to a flat 5 damage per instance of damage, up to a cap of 50% of each damage source, making Pella characters like Tracer fucking useless into armor. But oh wait, tanks still have nothing to help them once that armor health is gone, so tanks still die once they get to about half health, so they buffed that amount to 10 flat damage per instance of damage. And wait, did I mention that this also does nothing for snipers, thus making them strong again by comparison to the other character archetypes? And also, for some reason, Bob got this change? Is he a tank? Is he not a tank? I mean, he's pretty big, so we'll call him a tank. All of this has compounded onto each other to make tank a class that more people want to play, since they've given them an answer for a lot of pain points that tanks have had for a while, and yet now we're back in the Schrodinger's tank situation where they are simultaneously unkillable kaijus and also are able to be put down by a strong breeze. In general, tank feels like the class that can easily go from shattering like glass to feeling like beings of uncounterable strength by doing simple number tweaks, since they've been consistently bloated with stats to their individual characters and the tank passives as of late. All of this character bloating has also led to the tanks having the potential strength of 2 characters, meaning that everyone in the server will just look at them in the eyes as they unload every single ability they have, and boom, now their power class that is effectively 2 people is gone. And all of this isn't even mentioning the fact that tanks also have to bait out an obscene amount of defensive abilities before they can so much as play the game. On a grenade, on a sleep dart, Zen Discord Orb, Kiriko TP and Suzu, Lifeweaver's, well, everything, Orisa's entire kit, Defense Matrix, Hinder, Hack, Hook, and by the time you've done all of that, you're either dead or some of those cooldowns are back, so good luck trying to do anything. These issues certainly aren't unique to tank, but they uniquely affect tank in a way because they're the ones who have to kind of initiate into all of this shit. Most of the time, the tanks will make the enemy team waste those cooldowns on you, and then the other 2 roles will have a much easier time killing from there. Obviously, it's people's responsibility to track cooldowns and know how to fight against them appropriately, but like most people aren't going to do anything unless they see somebody using an ability to run at their fucking team. Regarding the overall general question of how balanced Overwatch 1 was compared to Overwatch 2, I briefly mentioned above about content creators establishing the fact that having a 6th player made the game and the team compositions more complex, usually shrinking the gaps that players can take advantage of to break through overpowered comps, and generally reducing any weak points that certain characters might have. And while I believe this is ultimately true, I also firmly stand by the idea that just as new metas were coming through, shortly after, new ways to cheese those metas were also being developed. Sure, not everybody used the cheese against the meta, and that was just because like some ranks were simply not capable of utilizing those comps effectively, so it just made them easier to fight without having to cheese them. I think the situation we have in Overwatch 2 is a significantly lower ceiling for being an unstoppable force, but a significantly lower floor for entering that overpowered territory. While overpowered team comps felt significantly harder to break through if you didn't know how to fight them properly in Overwatch 1, now you only really need 1 overpowered character plus maybe another healer supporting them to be a nearly unstoppable force in Overwatch 2 due to just the completely ass-backwards balancing of some of the characters. In Overwatch 1, you'd basically be doing a team for a team. One team playing an overpowered composition, and one team playing a weird, unconventional composition to then counter them. In Overwatch, you have one guy playing something like pre-nerfed Cassidy or Mauga, and you need 3 or more people to actually counter that one guy. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but ultimately it's still not a 1-for-1. And combined with the general lower team size, I have less people that I can actually work with to counter those characters. And even if one of them is not expressly better than the power player, that makes it infinitely harder to deal with. And oftentimes I find that the success of fighting into the next overpowered singular hero is actually more dependent on how bad they are at playing that character, rather than how good I and my teammates are at fighting that character. The funniest part about all of this is that with how many different buffs they keep giving the tank roll passive, they're inadvertently creating the reality that 6v6 had, in that you already have some pretty strong tanks just by character design, but now those tanks just become better and better as you keep adding things to their roll passive that maybe weren't even intended to help them directly at the time of making the addition. This means that while you have situations like D.Va being hard countered by Zarya by character design, you also have other characters who are just like impossible to defeat sometimes because you just keep giving them buffs that were not intended to directly benefit them, thus slowly removing other counters that tank might have. If you buff armor because you generally think it's not doing enough against certain types of characters, then you have better fucking remembered the characters who you were buffing armor to fight against, and make sure that you didn't accidentally just remove one of that character's counters from the game. These constant buffs to the tank roll passive also create another issue where, because all of the responsibility is put on a singular tank in the game, it makes every minute difference between the 2 tank players, from matchups to even small differences in skill, extremely large, to the point where you can't afford to fuck up a single thing in that role. And it only gets worse as they keep buffing them, because then you will have to only be like 1% worse than the enemy tank to just get fucking deleted. Yes, I know some of you motherfuckers are going to come in here and skill issue me, but there's like a line where it's fair for me to lose the tank 1v1, and that line should not be drawn so far as to say that I deserve to die because one of the armrests in my gamer chair fell off and now my arm hurts a little bit. As a result of this insane balancing in the tank department, it also means that your DPS and supports cannot make up that gap unless they are like exceedingly better than the enemy DPS and supports. It's also quite burdensome to know that certain tanks can just run you over despite the enemy gamer being absolutely plastered out of their mind because Blizzard thought that Orisa needed buffs in any capacity. And on the flip side, it's also burdensome to know that certain tanks don't require that their players get any better at fighting certain matchups because they just keep nerfing the characters designed to counter that character. And this creates an issue of your character not being able to counter the enemy character through better positioning, outplaying them, generally being smarter than them, and sometimes it doesn't even matter if you're mechanically better than them. I previously mentioned certain characters like Reaper and Bastion never really being counterbalanced to account for Blizzard axing one of the tanks, but there are actually a couple more that I wanted to specifically shed light on, because while I'm sure plenty of us have our general issues with these characters, they're not necessarily the ones that you think of when you think they counter tanks. Like Widowmaker. This character has technically been nothing but nerfed if I'm not mistaken, but she, along with Hanzo, I generally think are just awful for the game in its current state. I wouldn't really call them broken by any means. I mean, certain matchups and certain maps, whatever. Also, apparently Hanzo has been at the bottom of the tier list for a pretty long time now, but that doesn't make them good for the game by any capacity. And I would even go so far as to say that the things that put Hanzo at the bottom of the tier list, generally being like an inconsistent character, are also the same things that make him bad for the game. Like being able to just get shot around a corner even though the Hanzo wasn't fucking looking at you. Any meta that Overwatch 2 could be in that doesn't revolve around either hypermobility or easy shield redeployment has been kind of a goldmine for Widowmaker, at least where the maps allow for it, as she can afford to just kind of be wherever she wants and keep up constant pressure like the sniper from TF2. I'll give Widow the benefit of the doubt, however, because TF2 doesn't really have crazy hypermobile characters that can get to your vantage point in one press of a button. That said, Widowmaker still has the ability to create pressure by her mere existence, because until you learn how she plays the game, you can't really afford to try and contest her unless you're willing to risk losing your head. Widowmaker also got her range fall off nerfed a few months ago, and while it's definitely been noticeable how much she herself has not been able to one-shot me, if the Widow was actually smart, or if her team was at least semi-coordinated and were playing with their fucking monitors on, somebody else on their team probably would have noticed me hanging on by the edge of my life and would have been having one of the easiest kills of their lives. Obviously, it doesn't always work like that, but in combination with her being able to be pocketed and being able to get a massive aerial advantage if only for a moment, I have never found Widowmaker less fun to fight than in this current state of 5v5. Widowmains are going to get hella mad at me if I don't mention the fact that tanks are also the easiest class to just kind of walk at her because of their gigabuff nature and gigabuffed health pool that is simply too large for her to fight against, but it all kind of goes back to the counter-swapping issue. If you as Widowmaker are creaming my team, and I'm playing Winston, and I'm killing you because my team can't get the job done, I'm liable for having a Mauga, a Reaper, and maybe a Bastion thrown at me after the first lost fight, and the vicious cycle of abuse continues. And Hanzo is his own beast that I just despise fighting because for some reason they thought that a sniper character who is designed to play at mid to long ranges should have an anti-dive instant delete button that only takes about one more button press worth of skill than Scatter Arrow. And then I move on to Sombra, and Sombra, I fucking hate you. I hate what you represent in this game. I hate what you've done to the way that Overwatch has to be played. I hate how your entire kit revolves around being a little fucking rat and letting the enemy gamers have as little fun as possible. I hate how quick people are to swap to you when someone like a Widowmaker or an Ana is providing a little too much value to their team. And I especially hate how you are just so nominally good at all of these things. It would be one thing if I was just mad because I don't like fighting invisible characters who do nothing but disable my abilities and get away scot-free, but goddamn, can you really provide nothing better to your team other than spawn camping the poor support and having our team still lose a 4v4 because that poor support could actually give us the edge that we need in a fight? How does your character have support ability in the form of being able to hack health packs, a valued albeit underused resource in this game, and you choose to spend your time being a fucking nuisance and just holding right click on someone while not contributing anything else? And most importantly, why is it working? Well, I know why it's working, and it's just because like Sombra can hack you out of just about every ultimate ability in the game to just completely disable it, and ults are like a pretty important part of winning Overwatch team fights. And unfortunately, one of the only things that I can think to do is either CC her out of her cooldowns to death to make sure she doesn't get away, or play Zarya to at least protect whoever she's trying to dive on. I'd also like to address this really small point that was made in the Overwatch dev blog regarding the reason why they were hesitant to switch back to 6v6, which is that they're trying to be mindful about all of the new Overwatch 2 players who are only used to Overwatch 5v5. But I'm like, what about us? What about all the people from Overwatch 1, all the people who understand 6v6? Did you consult or care about any of us when you switched to 5v5? Yeah, I didn't think so, so either quit lying or be more transparent about it next time. Additionally, all the time that they spent working on making this format change probably could have been used to actually try and fix some of the issues in Overwatch 1. But hey, they probably made more money re-releasing the same game, and I'm not an economics person, so maybe that was enough of a win for them to make up this sob story. Aaron Keller also made a very important point regarding the balance between offense and defense-oriented game modes and maps, specifically noting that their main goal was to encourage much more aggressive and offensive plays in light of these tank changes and format changes. The main concern that I have with this, though, is the way they've chosen to approach this is like, not only were defensive abilities like shields removed or toned down, but they also removed a core proponent of holding defensive compositions, thus cutting the ability to defend yourself in half. And now with the inclusion of more characters with offensive abilities like Javelin, Spear, Kitsune Rush, and general increased movement options, it makes holding defensive positions feel so fucking miserable sometimes. Obviously, the existence of abilities like this don't inherently make the game more offense-oriented since you can just use them on defense, but coupling the existence of these abilities with the long treks that have to be taken for the defense team makes losing even one teammate almost guarantee that your hold gets broken. Unless they get rezzed by a Mercy, but don't even get me fucking started on her. At the end of the day, I'm happy to see that Blizzard is at least humoring the idea of 6v6, and hopefully they're at least thinking about some of the changes that I've mentioned. Not like I'm expecting them to see this video, but you get the point I'm trying to make. Despite how strongly I spoke about some of these issues surrounding 5v5, I'm still gonna keep playing the game, even if they ultimately decide that 6v6 isn't the way to go. And I'm hoping that this will at least open up their eyes to the possibilities of bringing it back in the future. If it ends up being a colossal balancing nightmare, then I hope they will at least try to make it work. But if they choose not to, there's no harm in them trying. On top of them trying to make the change work, I'm also hoping they are paying very close attention to what their high-end players and content creators are speaking on, because the name of the game is transparency and actually opening up your ears when people have something to say, rather than ignoring them because you think you know best. Now is the best time to try and rectify your mistakes and be open to the fact that they were mistakes. And if they weren't, at least be willing to entertain the idea that maybe you made a decision in good faith that ultimately didn't pan out the way that you were expecting. The simple thought that Blizzard wants to try 6v6 is a sign that they're actually listening to the community. So whether this change ends up being a boom or a bust, it's at least a sign that we're moving in the right direction.